thank you all for coming tonight. We have Dr. Jamie Smith, and he's going to talk about marijuana, the behavioral effects, cognitive effects, emotional effects, and the facts. Mm-hmm. And it is a controversial issue. He's going to tell us about that. And he was here in January and presented an absolutely wonderful presentation on addiction. So thought we had to have him back. So let's give him a welcome.
Peace and harmony, everybody. How you doing this evening? All right. I understand that this is being recorded and it's going to be posted at some point. And so my wife told me to tell her hello. Hi, babe. So got that done. Marijuana, just the facts. I'm Jamie Smith. Everybody just calls me Jamie. I have a PhD in counselor education and supervision, for whatever that's worth. I am a licensed professional counselor, LPC, here in Missouri. I've been doing that gig for a while. I actually grew up in the mental health industry doing addictions treatment, so that's an area of specialty. I kind of have a cross interest of, I also have a specialty in trauma care. And then particularly working with people where addiction and trauma overlap. So that's kind of my area of specialization. The other initials are just to make me look more important than I am. So National Certified Counselor, Approved Clinical Supervisor, Board Certified Telemental Health Provider. That's what those mean. Somebody asked earlier. I am the director currently of Curriculum Instruction and Assessment at Lincoln University School of Education. That means I deal with a lot of data and just information for program quality improvement. That's what I do on a day-to-day basis. I do maintain a private practice. I see folks on the side, pro bono, people that are underinsured, that are low income. I'll see them. I keep a very low caseload because I also, besides work, I'm married and have kids. But I do keep a low caseload and work primarily with people who have experienced childhood trauma, and I see them pro bono. So that's about me and what we're doing tonight. So what are we going to do tonight? So tonight's objectives are we're going to understand the physical effects of cannabinoid substances. Cannabinoid is fancy word, right, for cannabis and that class of substances like marijuana on the body. We're going to talk about it, what it does in the brain. We're going to talk about how it affects our immune system, heart, lungs, gastrointestinal systems, and reproductive system, right? So that's what we're going to do. We're also going to understand the emotional and behavioral effects of cannabis use. So how does it affect our emotions? How can it influence our behaviors? And the information we're going to use it is based on research. So we're going to use this data. This is research evidence-based, right? What I'm going to share with you tonight. This isn't conjecture or opinion. This is stuff that's been established in research. We're going to critically evaluate some common myths surrounding marijuana use. That is both from the camp that says marijuana is awesome, everybody should do it, it would make the world a better place, and from the camp that says marijuana is Satan's tool, right? So we're gonna look at some of those myths from both camps. So if you have any of those myths that you want to throw out at me, go ahead. We can critically evaluate some of those. What we're not going to do, we're not going to debate the merits and liabilities of legalization tonight. I have an opinion about that, but by the end of the night, you're not going to know what my opinion is. We won't argue about the facts. The information presented tonight is it's evidenced from research, right? So this is what we're doing. We will acknowledge where the research is still lacking. I think that's really important. A lot of the claims, those myths that we hear, the claims that we hear are exaggerated things. So there may be a kernel of truth in it, but then people take it into other areas. We won't be disrespectful with those with whom we disagree on the topic. So there's still a lot of room for debate on the issue of marijuana, right? This just isn't the room or the time to have that debate. So, okay, that being said, some general principles of research. I wanted to talk about this first so that you kind of get an idea of when we're talking about research and evidence. The first one is correlation does not imply causation. Has anybody ever heard that before? Yeah, a lot of people, right? So what does that mean? It means that in the summertime, the amount of ice cream that gets eaten goes up, and the number of people that drown go up. And so there's a correlation between the amount of ice cream that's eaten and the number of people that drown. But one does not cause the other, right? That's what a correlation is. A correlation is whenever you can identify a pattern where things move together. We can talk about positive correlations. Now, here's where this gets a little technical. Positive correlations are when things go up together or they go down together, right? So one thing increases and another thing increases. One thing decreases, another decreases. Both of those are positive correlations. A negative correlation is when one thing goes up and another thing goes down. Or this side goes up and this side goes down. So that's the teeter-totter. That's a negative correlation. So when we talk about correlations tonight, we'll be talking about those things. But remember that just because two things are together doesn't mean that one causes the other. It just means that we recognize that there's a relationship between them somehow, right? But they're not causal. It's not a causal relationship. The other thing to remember about research is that research is always specific. We're talking about a specific intervention or a specific substance with a specific population within a specific context, right? So, and that's really important when it comes to research, because what we're going to find in the research is that a lot of the research is that specific. There are researchers that only look at CBD, right, and the benefits of CBD. There are researchers that only look at THC, and we'll talk about what CBD and THC and CBN are here in a minute, but that only look at those specific chemicals within marijuana. And so what I've done tonight is I've tried to tease some of those things apart, where when we're talking about marijuana, we're talking about marijuana, but sometimes we're going to be talking specifically about CBD, and sometimes, which is a marijuana derivative, and sometimes we're going to talk about THC, which is the psychoactive ingredient, right? Sometimes we're going to be talking about other elements of the marijuana. But we have to remember that research is always specific. So we're going to be talking about those things. The other thing we have to remember about that research is that research is, the research on CBD, THC, whatever it is always a controlled dose. And so when researchers are looking, they know how much has been given for how long. And so they can measure that effect, right? And so that's very different than people's experience who might buy marijuana off the street, right? Because you don't know what the content of that little bag is, or even if it's been laced with something else. So we have to remember those kinds of distinctions as well. It's always specific, and it's also population specific. And so there's certain populations that it has this certain effect on, but they haven't seen that effect on this population over here. So we're going to try and tease some of that stuff apart, right? And the last thing is confirmation bias. I like this cartoon. Did you read my paper on confirmation bias? Yes, but it only proved what I already knew, right? Sometimes people approach research with, this is what I believe, so let me find the research to back it up, right? As opposed to with a more open, kind of curious stance to knowledge that says, you know, I might be wrong about this. And I'm not an awful person for having a wrong opinion or not having all of the information. And it's okay to not have all of the information, right? So I'm approaching research to learn what I don't know. And that's a very different stance, and it requires an openness to these things, right? So if we're looking for research just to back up what we already know, we're using research wrongly. All right, that's called confirmation bias. Moving on. Now we're going to get into marijuana. Not really. We're going to start talking about marijuana. What is it? What is marijuana? I have my notes out here. I have a lot of notes for this one slide, so I have to get to them real quick. I had them out and now they've closed, which figures. All right. I'm getting there. Hang on. Marijuana is a branch of the cannabis plant, right? We all know that. The very first written accounts of cannabis cultivation, where people were actually growing it on purpose, are found in China from around 28 BCE, or BC, if you prefer. The writings state that while the plant was primarily grown for fiber, they were familiar with its intoxicating qualities. So they knew that it would affect the way you perceive reality and the way you feel, right? There was a mummy that was exhumed in ancient Egypt that dated from around 950 BCE, and they found remnants of marijuana in its internal organs when they autopsied the mummy. So they know that it's been ingested for thousands of years. By 1000 CE or AD, if that's more common for you, that were higher than any human being could possibly consume. So you're going to see studies that show, well, it suppresses the immune system in rats. Yes, it did, but no human being would take that much THC, right? So is that valid? I don't know. You make up your mind. Researchers in the 1980s found little to no effect. So those are studies go back to the 80s. In the last 10 years, they've seen a reduction in immune system function in human medical marijuana users, but you have to think, these are medical marijuana users, so they're sick. They're using it for medicinal purposes, so they already have a compromised immune system. And so, you have to be careful with those kinds of things. So what is its effect on the immune system? The bottom line is we don't know. We don't know. There are studies that show it has no effect if it's a healthy person. There are studies that show on people who are using it medicinally, it can weaken the immune system, but their immune system was already weakened. So what do you do with that? We don't know. So that's an area where research, its effect on the immune system really needs to be done a lot more. The heart. Marijuana increases the heart rate by 20 to 30 beats per minute when someone is ingesting marijuana or derivatives. And this is probably a place where I should have put THC more than marijuana. But marijuana increases. We know that ingesting it. Frequent smokers, and this is smokers specifically, develop a mild tolerance to the effect, but they still experience an increased heart rate, right? Specifically smoking marijuana decreases heart efficiency. So it makes the heart work harder when you're smoking it. Individuals with heart disease or heart arrhythmia have an increased risk from use because of that, as opposed to people with no history of heart disease or other associated illnesses. There's no evidence that marijuana causes heart disease. So it can exacerbate problems for someone that already has some kind of cardiac issue. But there's no evidence that says that marijuana would cause a heart or cardiac issue. Thoughts about that? Move along. We'll move along. Marijuana in the lungs. So there's two questions really that need to be asked when we talk about marijuana in the lungs. The first question is, does smoking marijuana impair lung function? Right? So does it make it harder for your lungs to do what they need to do? The second one is, does smoking marijuana cause lung cancer? So we know that smoking tobacco, right, causes lung cancer. We're going to get into this about whether smoking marijuana does. All right, so yes to the first question. Smoking marijuana impairs lung function. So researchers have found that smoking marijuana reduces the airflow in the lungs, Some chronic marijuana smokers, so that's people who would smoke 3 or more joints a day, which is a lot. They have the same instances of chronic bronchitis as cigarette smokers who smoke a pack or more a day. So smoking 3 or more joints a day affects them the same way that smoking a pack a day would impair a tobacco smoker. Researchers have also found that chronic marijuana smokers, these are chronic marijuana smokers, the 3 or more joints a day, also found that chronic marijuana smokers have an increased risk of abnormal cell growth in their respiratory airways, so in their nasal passages, in their windpipe, that kind of stuff, to use those terms, compared to both non-smokers and cigarette smokers. So it's actually more of an effect in marijuana than tobacco smoke. Overall, there's little difference between the smoke that marijuana produces and the smoke that tobacco, when you look at it chemically. When they break down, they capture that smoke and they break it down chemically to see what's in the smoke, there's very little difference between tobacco smoke and marijuana smoke. So it does impair lung functions. The answer to the second question is we don't know whether smoking marijuana causes lung cancer. There's not been established in research a definitive conclusion. So part of the problem is that it's really hard to find a sample of participants who only smoke marijuana. Because even sometimes the way that marijuana is consumed, I don't know if you're familiar with a blunt. Has anybody heard that term in marijuana use? Right, it's where they hollow out a cigar and then pack the cigar with marijuana. So they're actually smoking tobacco and marijuana at the same time, right? And so, and most marijuana users will also smoke tobacco. So it's really hard to find people that only smoke marijuana so we can follow them longitudinally to see what the health effects are and be able to isolate those to marijuana. You can't give somebody who's healthy and has never smoked a joint and say, here, we want you to smoke one of these a day for the next 5 years so we can see how it hurts you, right? That's unethical research, right? So, yeah, when a sample of participants who have only smoked marijuana was found, they've actually, they were able to isolate a group in some other research that they were doing. These people have only smoked marijuana. The research results are mixed. So there's no definitive evidence that there is an increased risk of lung cancer among those who smoke both marijuana and tobacco. So what does that mean? It means we don't know if combining marijuana and tobacco increases the chances that they will develop lung cancer longitudinally, in the long term. We just don't know that, right? As opposed to those who smoke tobacco alone. They just haven't been able to tease those apart. Any thoughts before I sally forth? All right. Okay. So how marijuana is smoked is significant though. So what happens, marijuana smokers don't just, right? So that's not how people smoke marijuana. Marijuana smokers do not smoke, they tend not to smoke as often as cigarette smokers, but when they smoke, it's inhaled more deeply. They take it deeper into the lungs and they hold it longer. Sometimes it's an average of about 4 times as long that they hold the smoke in their lungs before they exhale, compared to cigarette smokers. And so the toxins inherent in that smoke have more opportunity to have an effect because it's there longer, right? And it's deeper in the lungs. So researchers found that carbon monoxide in the blood measured 5 times higher for marijuana smokers than cigarette smokers. And the tar that was collected in the lungs that they could measure was 3 times higher than in cigarette smokers. And it's because of the way that marijuana is normally smoked. It's taken in deeper, it's held longer. All right. So the bottom line, smoking marijuana impairs lung function. There's no definitive link between marijuana and lung cancer. Before we go to the next, is there anybody want to talk about? Any questions, thoughts? Sally forth. Marijuana and the digestive system. So they've developed this thing, it's called chronic hyperemesis syndrome, and it's linked to marijuana users. And emesis means vomiting. So it's hyper means they puke a lot, right? They have found this in some few cases, that it is linked. Now, here's the interesting thing. This is the cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, recurrent episodes of nausea and vomiting that last days and sometimes weeks. So they're just throwing up all the time, right? And they often have significant dehydration because of the vomiting. There's no solid research on what percentage of marijuana users will develop this. We just don't know. So it's like you know, roll your die, right? It seems to be a minority. Not most people that smoke marijuana aren't going to develop CHS, right? There is a minority that do. There's no solid research evidence that demonstrates any other commonalities. So for some reason, some marijuana smokers develop CHS, and we really don't know why, but we know it's a minority. Yeah.
Only smokers? Not other ingesters?
It's attached to smoking, yeah. So, yep. All right. Marijuana in the reproductive system. Some chronic long-term users experience some effects, but these are pretty rare. Men who are long-term chronic users may experience decreased sperm production. That's supposed to be production. Decreased sperm production. Marijuana also increases the release of the hormone prolactin. So remember, what we said is that it actually affects other areas of the brain, right? And so it actually increases this hormone prolactin, which can cause breast development in men. So, so there is that. Women who are long-term chronic users may experience disruption in their menstrual cycle regularity. So those are the effects that they've seen associated with it. There's no real solid kind of this number of people. If you have these characteristics, it will probably affect you that way. Again, it's kind of, we know that it affects some people this way. Roll your dice. See if it's you. All right. Any other, so that's in the body. That's our body and how our body reacts to marijuana. Questions, comments, thoughts before we move on to some of this other stuff? Is this helpful at all? Is it interesting?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh boy. Okay. Woohoo! Emotional effects. Not all users experience, this is an interesting thing about marijuana. It doesn't affect everybody the same way. And they really don't know why. It affects different people different ways. It makes it really hard to classify marijuana with other classifications. So we have like sedatives or depressants, right, that bring the body down. We know CBD does that. But we also have stimulants that raise certain things, right? And we know that THC will raise like cortisol and make people more jittery and anxious. So we don't really know. So marijuana gets its own classification. Marijuana is classified as a cannabis substance. And then you have derivatives and you have synthetics that are in that cannabinoid family. And the reason is because it's just so unique in the way that it affects us. The method of ingestion and THC content of the substance is going to influence how quickly people feel its intoxicating effects. And this is something that people who use edibles, sometimes they, well, let me put it this way. This is what happens. So you smoke marijuana and it goes into the lungs, which have direct access to the blood, which then goes to the brain, and people start feeling the effects within 5 to 10 minutes, right? However, if a person takes an edible marijuana, THC thing, and eats it, it has to go through the digestive system, be broken down, absorbed, and then, so it can take up to 30 minutes before somebody feels that high, right? So what happens is people who are using it to feel that high, they're like, oh, I took that like 10 minutes ago. I don't feel anything. I'm going to eat some more. And they're like, oh. So now it's been 20 minutes since their first. They're like, man, I still don't feel anything. So they take another big clump of it, right? And then 30 minutes, that first dose kicks in. And then it starts building, right? And that can just absolutely freak people out, because now they've taken 3 times the amount that they normally would, because it takes longer to have its effect. See? So the method of ingestion is really important. There are lotions and things like that people will rub on their skin, and it gets absorbed through the skin. That takes a long time to get to the brain, because it has to go through the skin, which is, our skin is made to keep stuff out, right? So, there's different things like this. So the method of ingestion is really important, and how fast somebody gets intoxicated. Some users are going to experience a sedative and euphoric effect. So they're just like, this makes me mellow, right? That's the mellow. And that can last several hours. Some users will describe like heightened sense experiences. So it's almost like the world goes into like 5G, what's the word I'm looking for? HD, right? High definition, So they experience that vision. They feel like their vision becomes more acute, right? They can see subtle nuances in like art, and they can hear subtle nuances in music that they can't when they're not under THC's effect, right? And so they have that kind of heightened sense experience. Some users reported a heightened sense of curiosity, or what they call intellectual interest. It's like suddenly, and they think that this is actually linked to the feelings of acute sensory experiences, because they're noticing things that they didn't notice before. And it just kind of, it's like suddenly the world becomes new, and they approach it through this lens of seeing something for the first time, maybe that they've seen 100 times before. And so they get curious about it, and they start, and that's where you watch these stoner movies, and they're talking about these philosophical things, and questions come up and that kind of stuff. So that's what they're describing, and they think that that's linked to that heightened sensory experience, that they're experiencing the world in a new way. Users will report that their sense of time slows down. And so they'll think that, they'll think that they've been at something for hours, but it's been like 10 minutes, right? So they have this sense that time has slowed down. So, So those are some of the, I think, is that a typo? No, okay. So those are some of the emotional effects. So what kind of behaviors does this lead to? The mellow part is probably the most interesting to me, because it does bring people down, and people will get reinforced for that mellow behavior. I once worked with a young man. He was 15 years old, but he actually was first exposed to marijuana when he was 7 years old. And what he noticed through his own lived experience is that he got in less trouble when he went to school high. And so the teachers were inadvertently affirming his marijuana use, right? Because when he went to school high, he was mellow and he was calm and he could sit at his desk. But, and so his teachers were like, man, you're really being on it today, right? The rest of the time he was kind of hyperactive, right? And then the teachers would have to get after him. And so he would get in trouble when he wasn't high. So those are the kinds of behavioral things that we see. We have to be careful of those things. There's, well, I don't want to get into that. Okay. I was going to get into some behavioral things that involve like criminality, but then that starts leading to legality, and I don't want to go there. So, because I don't want to have that conversation tonight. So any thoughts about the emotions? A lot of people that that experience these things get very mellow, and their behavior is just very kind of, there's a few exceptions. We're going to get to those exceptions in just a minute.
Back to that chart with the flower petals. If you try it once and experience sadness, are you likely to experience that same thing again with another use?
You know, that's the interesting thing about substances in general, is that you know, alcohol doesn't affect me the same way it would affect you. And there's a lot of reasons for that. There's genetics, there's my body mass, there's have I eaten today and have you not eaten today, right? So, and the same is true with like marijuana. So marijuana isn't going to affect us the same way, right? So this is a long answer to that question. So if somebody tries something and they have negative effects, they're probably not going to do it again, right? They're like, oh, I didn't like the way that made me feel, right? So they're probably not going to do it again. So absolutely. Does that answer your question? Did that answer your question? Repeat your question for me.
Well, just, okay, so if you experience serenity the first time you ever try it, are you likely to experience...
Repeat that?
Yeah.
Yeah. This is where you get into like chasing the high, because what happens, what a lot of people will tell you is that it never feels as good the second time. But this is part of the addictive cycle, because I want it to feel that good again. And so they would experience, maybe instead of serenity, they would feel just kind of at peace, and they're like, well, this isn't as good as last time. So I'm going to try it again, see if I can get back to that. And when you hear people who have experienced addiction talk about chasing the high, that's what they're talking about. Or chasing my first high, that's what they're talking about. Because when people use a substance, especially over time, they develop tolerance to the substance. And so they have to use more of it to get to the same place, right? So it would probably be in that category, but would it be the exact same feeling? Probably not, and probably not as intense. So that's a good question, though. But people will react kind of the same, but over time it loses its intensity. Any other thoughts? Let's talk about some of the common notions that go along with it. It's just an herb, man. It's natural, right? Well, yes, this is true. A great many things until they are prepared for human consumption. Tomatoes are very natural until you turn them into ketchup, right? When they're prepared for human consumption, tobacco, cane sugar, wheat, all of these are natural things that grow. But then you prepare them for human consumption and it changes them, right? And that's what we have to understand. So yes, absolutely, it is a naturally occurring weed, right? But when it's prepared for human consumption, it's prepared specifically and altered specifically to enhance its intoxicating effects. Or, you know, if they harvest it early and it's CBD, they're doing that specifically because of the CBD, right? So it's not like, oh, it's just, I can go pick some up off the street corner, literally out of the ground, roll it up and smoke it, and it's going to be okay because it's not been processed yet, right? So you don't know what that would do to you. So just because something is naturally occurring, is a naturally occurring plant, doesn't mean it's good for me to consume. I'm not going to go out and smoke poison ivy, right? So we have to be careful with that. So that's one of the things that people will say. They are absolutely right. It is a naturally occurring plant until it's been processed for consumption. All right. Marijuana causes schizophrenia. Have any of you heard this? That marijuana causes schizophrenia? No, it doesn't. There is a link between people with schizophrenia and marijuana use. That is a positively correlated reality. Those two things go together. But there's no causal link. There's also a link between schizophrenia and tobacco use. We know that a huge number of people who struggle with schizophrenia also smoke tobacco. Does tobacco cause schizophrenia? No, right? So now, that being said, there are some cases of people who might be particularly sensitive to the psychotropic effects of the psychoactive properties of it. And it can cause the hippocampus. The hippocampus is this area right here, it has the highest concentration of cannabinoid receptors. The hippocampus is essential for new memory formation. The presence of THC suppresses the activity of hippocampal cells, so it keeps them from working. So it interferes with the ability of the brain to form new memories. So I think I work at a college campus, right? So I think about students that are trying to study while they're high, right? They're wasting their time. Not completely, but it makes it a lot harder for them to understand and remember the material. Now, anything they studied before they got high, they're going to be able to remember. But while THC was present in activating those cannabinoid receptors in the hippocampus, it's harder for them to retain that new information, right? I think about this when I go out to eat and the wait staff comes back and asks me 4 times what drink I ordered, right? So I'm like, okay, red flag to me, right? So I don't know if that's the case or not, but I always kind of giggle to myself because I'm like, oh, I wonder if this person just had their break, right? So people can recall information that's already learned. They have difficulty remembering information that they're given. There's 2 other areas of the brain with high concentrations of endocannabinoid receptors, the cerebellum and the basal ganglia. So, do I have the the cerebellum is here, and the basal ganglia is here, right? They are involved in coordinating some fine motor movements. So, gross motor movements, like picking up a cup, would be like a gross motor movement, right? It doesn't involve a lot of, but if I had a lid on the cup and I was trying to put a straw through the little cross on the top, that would be harder because that takes more precision, you see. So things that take precision. A person that is smoking marijuana might be able to drive a car because gross motor movement. However, they would not be able to thread a needle. Fine motor movement, right? There's other reasons why somebody that's on marijuana should not drive a car, which we'll get to in the emotional stuff and psychological stuff. But it's not going to interfere with their gross motor movement the way like alcohol intoxication would, right? It doesn't have that same effect. So, so those 2 areas of the brain. The cortex, so the gray matter, right? All of that stuff that we talk about. Researchers have more recently found, and shout out to Christine who pointed me to a study. I went and I got the original resource on this, not the news article, but it's really interesting. In longitudinal studies. So this is a study of over time, right? So they took kids and they looked at their brains and then they followed them as they grew through adolescence, right? And what they found in these kids was that the ones who ingested THC, again, we're talking specifically about ones who used THC as opposed to like CBD or some other one of the other marijuana derivative type things. But THC on a regular basis experience a thinning of their cortical matter in their brains. So that area of the brain gets thinner. So this would have negative effects on behaviors such as impulse control and certain cognitive functions like long-term and abstract thinking. It would interfere with their ability to engage in those types of thinking. And they would have they're more impulsive. So other brain regulatory functions. Serotonin and cortisol are essential in mood and emotion regulation. Serotonin is linked to mood regulation, so we know that low serotonin is associated with depression, right? which is why we have SSRIs, which target serotonin. Cortisol is released in moments of anxiety. If I'm on the Katy Trail and a Missouri bear comes at me, my cortisol is going to go up, right? So anxiety. High cortisol is associated with feeling anxious. So there's a correlational link, not a causal link, between low serotonin and high cortisol in marijuana use. So what does that tell us? It tells us that we know that people that suffer from depression and anxiety often use marijuana, but we don't know what came first. You can't say that the marijuana caused the depression or the anxiety, right? Because they may have been vulnerable to that or had depression or anxiety before they started using. Right, but we know that those two things are linked. A lot of people who have depression and anxiety use marijuana. So.
Question, so
Yes.
correlation does imply causation?
No, that's supposed to be does not.
Oh.
Typo,
I
ignore
thought you were
that.
testing us.
Good eye.
No, good eye, yep. You passed. All right. We do know that people who use marijuana tend to experience higher levels of anxiety. Their anxiety goes up. And the reason is because we know whether they are more prone to anxiety before they started or if the marijuana use led to higher anxiety. We don't really know that. But we know that cortisol increases during marijuana use, and specifically THC. So this is important. Cortisol increases as THC in the system increases, right? So what happens is it creates this cycle. So we don't really know where the cycle starts, right? But at some point, somebody's gonna ingest marijuana. Now, CBD, right, because when we're smoking and there's THC, there's still gonna be trace amounts of that CBD. CBD has a sedative effect. It brings us down, right? That's what CBD does. And so what happens is somebody smokes marijuana and they get that sedative effect off of the CBD that's in it. But then the THC, we know, contributes to higher cortisol. Those two are connected. We know that. But what happens is the sedative effect wears off, leaving the person with those increased cortisol levels. So now the person feels anxious again, so they ingest more marijuana. And so it becomes this cycle. Uh-oh.
No.
All right, don't worry about that. We've got 30 minutes anyway, because I didn't want to go over an hour.
Yeah.
All right, but it creates this cycle, right? But we don't really know where the cycle starts. And that's the important thing to remember. But we do know that THC specifically is linked to higher cortisol levels. The CBD helps the sedative effect, so it helps calm them down. But then the CBD effect wears off, the THC effect wears off, but the cortisol is still high. Yeah?
So if someone just smokes marijuana and it doesn't have THC in it.
If they're smoking and it has THC in it.
Okay.
CBD is not smoked. CBD is usually taken in like a pill or some kind of liquid form.
Oh. See how little I know.
Yeah. Yeah.
And do you call that addiction, or is that a strong word for that?
Addiction might be a strong word for it, because addiction comes with a whole bunch of other behavioral activities as well. So, and mental activities. So, yeah. But this can certainly lead to addiction. It can, not it will, right? But it can lead to addiction. So, that's one of the myths at the end. Can you be addicted to marijuana? Because there are people that say you can't get addicted to marijuana. Okay. Marijuana and the immune system. Okay, any other questions about marijuana and the brain? Any of that stuff we just went over and how it affects the brain? Yeah.
How is it different from someone who's drinking alcohol in terms of what it does to the brain, you know, the effects?
Okay, so the action is actually kind of the same, except it's different neurotransmitters. So when someone drinks alcohol, they're ingesting a synthetic neurotransmitter, right, that displaces the neurotransmitters that are naturally there, right, and then it intensifies that effect. Whatever that natural neurotransmitter would have done, the alcohol is more intensive, right? That's the same way that THC and CBD work. THC and CBD displace those natural endocannabinoids, right? And then it intensifies the effect. So, that's that. It works in the same way that alcohol works in the brain, but because it's working on different neurotransmitters, it has a different effect in terms of emotions and the overall experience, right? So that's a great question. Any other thoughts about the brain, and this is your brain on drugs? Okay. So they used animal subjects. Their favorite animal to use is rats. And actually, because rat brains and the way they function are very similar to human brains and the way our brains function. So they love doing experiments like this on rats. Have indicated that there is a suppression of immune system function in the test subjects. Okay, this is actually, the problem is that the subjects were given doses of THC, schizophrenia-like symptoms, while the person is intoxicated. So there are some people that may react with paranoia and delusions, and in rare cases, hallucinations, right? But when the substance has been metabolized out of their system, those symptoms go away. So we know it was caused by the presence of THC in their system. So it doesn't cause schizophrenia. People with schizophrenia tend to smoke marijuana. That's positively correlated. One does not cause the other. And we know that for some people it has this effect. So that can look like schizophrenia. Marijuana is a treatment for ... All right, cancer. Does marijuana treat cancer? Bob Marley died of cancer in his 30s, right? So anyway, there you go. The CBD can be used to alleviate certain symptoms or side effects of chemotherapy, like nausea, loss of appetite, etc. But THC has no medicinal purpose. CBD can be a sedative that can address a lot of different things. THC has no medicinal purpose. THC gets you high, right? Glaucoma. Marijuana is a treatment for glaucoma. CBD will reduce blood pressure in the optic nerve. That's true. They've noticed that, which can alleviate some of the symptoms, but it does not treat it or improve a person's vision, right? So it can, so anxiety, ADHD, and depression. CBD can act as a sedative to address like anxiety, to bring people down with ADHD, help them focus. It can alleviate some symptoms, but it's not a treatment for these conditions, right? We have to make a distinction between palliative relief of symptoms and treatment of a disease. And that's where it gets confused a lot of times. People say, marijuana treats cancer because cancer patients on chemotherapy can then, they can eat and it reduces their nausea. That's not treatment, that's palliative relief of the side effects of chemotherapy, right? But it's not treating their cancer. And we need to make that distinction. When you're if a person is using the CBD as a palliative, kind of thing to reduce symptoms of something, they need to weigh benefits with risks. So, you can't get addicted to marijuana. So the reality is that somebody can become addicted to any substance or behavior that alters their mood. So that's just the reality of it. But addiction has this whole other set of behaviors and attitudes and kind of worldview, right? So we have to be careful when people are talking about being addicted to marijuana. Just because somebody's using it or somebody's using it heavily doesn't mean they're addicted. You know, we have to look at the entire kind of constellation of their behaviors to be able to diagnose an addiction. Because it's not use does not equal addiction. Use of a substance does not equal addiction. Physical dependence on the substance is very rare. It can happen. People do experience withdrawal symptoms. When people are smoking heavily and they quit smoking, they can experience things like they feel jittery, they get headaches, maybe a little bit of sweating, those kinds of things. It's stuff that can be treated with aspirin and you go on about your day, right, when they're experiencing those things. So withdrawal symptoms are very, very mild if a person has started to develop a physical dependency on the cannabis substance. It's going to depend on how heavily a person uses. You would have to smoke a ton or take a ton of marijuana to overdose. I mean, it's just practically, and I mean that literally, practical. It's impossible. You're not going to overdose on marijuana, right? It's just not going to happen. Dude, everybody's doing it, right? So every year we do this survey. Partners in Prevention is an organization. It's a grant-funded program by the state that's coordinated out of Mizzou. There are 24 colleges and universities that participate in Partners in Prevention, and every year they do what's called the Missouri Assessment of College Health Behavior Study. And so they just send it out randomly to college students at the 24 universities that participate. In the 2021 survey, they had 10,154 college students respond from across the state of Missouri, all within the state of Missouri. So that's a lot. That is a representative sample of Missouri college students. It's enough to be a representative sample. 61% of the respondents from these 24, the 10,154, 24 different colleges, reported that they have never smoked marijuana. 61%. So 6 out of 10 have never used marijuana. Now, the 39% that said, yeah, I've used it in the past, they said, how much have you used within the last year? Right? How often, not how much. How often have you smoked within the last year? So that's what this pie chart is. And this big section right here, which equals 68% of that 39%, right? So we're talking about, if we're talking about 39% of 10,000, we're talking about 3,900 students, right? So that 39%, 68% of those 3,900 said they have not smoked in the last year. So now you're up to what? 68% is 2/3, right? So that's 2,600 plus the 6,100. So that's 8,000, 9,000. Is that right? What is that? 6.20, what? I'm trying to think. We've got 2,600 plus, what was it? 6,100 is 8,000-ish. A little over, yeah. We'll say 8,200, right? 82%-ish have not smoked within the last year. 82% of college students. So not everybody's doing it. And then you have it broken down so that 1 to 6 times a year, these are people that maybe tried it within the last year, right? And they've only smoked it maybe once or maybe twice in the past year. And then you have the others that go down to daily users. This is the percentage that use it daily. This group here. It's less than 5% use marijuana on a daily basis. So not everybody's doing it. And I think that this is really important. So why do we think that everybody's doing it? There's a couple reasons. One is we tend to notice people that are doing things differently than we are. When I'm driving on 63 from here to Columbia, I notice the maniac that passes me going 100 miles per hour. And I notice that jerk that's slowing me down going 55 miles per hour, right? And now everybody is either a maniac or a jerk on the road, right? But the reality is I don't notice everybody else on the road that's going 70 or 75, right? So I don't notice them. So we tend to notice people that are doing things differently than we are. So we have a majority of people who don't notice one another. They notice the people that are smoking, and they particularly notice the people that are smoking a lot, but they don't notice the others, right? Everybody else that's like them. So they get this perception, we get this perception that everybody's doing it because those are the ones we notice, right? So that's the first reason. The second reason that people tend to think everybody's doing it is because what happens is when people smoke marijuana, their social circle shrinks. So you have the effect of everybody out here, the 82%-ish that have not smoked in the last year, noticing the others that are smoking. And you have the ones that are smoking gathering in small groups. And because they are only around their groups, it becomes a reinforced kind of perception. Well, everybody I know smokes. Well, yeah, that's because you only hang around with people who smoke, right? So it's kind of the self-selection that happens. So for the people that don't smoke, they're noticing the ones that do. And the people that do smoke are shrinking their social circle so that they're only around people who smoke. So everybody they know does smoke, right? Or does use. So cannabis use for intoxication had spread into the Eastern Mediterranean region, right? So that's modern day Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, and then kind of across and maybe down into Northern Africa area around there. And it began making its way into Europe. So that's about 1,000 years ago. In the 19th century, so 1800s, Napoleon's campaign in Egypt brought the use of hashish into Europe and particularly into France, where it became very chic to do that and to use it for intoxication. European explorers actually brought cannabis seed to the New World, the Western Hemisphere. After that, but it wasn't until the 20th century that it really became popular for use for intoxication purposes. So that's really when it became popular in the United States. There are two prevalent species of cannabis. There's cannabis sativa and cannabis indica. A cannabis plant contains over 400 different chemicals. And so I don't know how many of you are familiar with the 420 culture, right? But that's kind of where that idea comes from, that there's over 400, and people have said 420, but they really don't know, is it 419? Who knows, right? But they know there's over 400 different chemicals in a marijuana plant. The cannabis plant has multiple psychoactive ingredients that have different effects on us. So what happens is the primary one that everybody talks about is THC, which is delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, is what THC stands for, tetrahydrocannabinol. That's in the plant's resin, which is the secretion of the flower and some of it on the leaves. So it's kind of like it's a sticky secretion that allows for pollination of the plant. What else do I want to say about that? The leaves and the stalk of the plant have trace amounts. So within the leaves and the stalk itself, there are trace amounts of THC. But intoxication, if you're only using the leaves or the stalk of the plant, it's not very likely you're going to get intoxicated from that. So there's different things that affect the amount of resin that the plant can produce and turn into THC. Light, different types of fertilizer, the other kinds of growing conditions, all of those things can affect the amount of THC that's present in any particular plant. So what happens is the flowers of the plant produce this cannabinolic acid. That's kind of how it's pronounced. They like to use long words for this stuff, which is the shortened version of that is CBDA, which is then converted into what's called cannabidiol, basically, which is CBD, right? When the CBD is allowed to mature, it matures into THC, which is the primary psychoactive ingredient. So when it starts, the resin starts, it has a high concentration of CBD. If it's harvested then, it remains CBD. But if you allow it to mature, it turns into THC and it has a more potent, intoxicating effect. If the THC is not harvested, it's then converted to cannabinol as opposed to cannabidol, right? Cannabinol with an N, or CBN is the shortened version of that. So what marijuana growers want to do if they're growing it for intoxication is they want to hit that point where it's at its peak THC compound. So there'll be a little bit of CBD in it, maybe if it started to convert a little bit of CBN, but they're trying to harvest it at just the right time where that resin is at its peak for THC content. When it's harvested at that point, people talk about having a really clean high or a clear high because it's particularly potent. When marijuana is burned in the smoking process, it releases hundreds and hundreds of chemicals through the smoke and through the inhalation. So people are absorbing that into the body. This is an area where research is really lacking because the only chemicals from the marijuana plant that have been really thoroughly studied are CBD and THC. And what those chemicals do in the body, all of the rest of the chemicals that are released into the body, we really don't know what those do or what might happen with those chemicals interacting in our body. So as our body metabolizes all of those different chemical compounds. So that's what marijuana is. That's how when they grow it and then they want to harvest it at just the right point to either produce the CBD or the THC is what you want. You don't want the CBN. That's bad stuff. It really makes people feel awful. So if it's harvested too late. I feel like I need to stop. If anybody has questions or wants to make a comment. So, yeah.
So I've heard of Delta 9. I've heard of Delta 8. So what's Delta 8?
It's just another part of the process. Delta 9 is what they really want. So, but it's another one of the chemicals in there, another type of the THC. But Delta 9 is the one that they really want to get.
Well, and I don't want to get. So why is Delta 8 legal in Missouri, but Delta 9 is not?
It probably has to do with the difference between the CBD and the THC, and because remember it's a different step along the process to becoming that Delta 9. So the CBD is, and so Delta 8 could be that point before it really becomes that intoxicating. So they're looking what they're controlling for when they make things illegal is the intoxicating effect. And CBD doesn't have a lot of intoxicating effect. It does have some mood effects and things like that, but you don't get the high. You don't get high off CBD, right?
Is CBD the same as Delta-8?
I don't know the answer to that. I know that they're all kind of in that line. As it's growing towards THC, you've got CBD and Delta-8, but I don't know how close those two are linked to each other. So,
Thank you.
or whether they're using that as interchangeable with CBD. So, all right. So let's talk about marijuana in the body. That's just the slide to introduce the next topic. Okay. We need to understand a little bit about how brain mechanics work, right? So a neuron exists as like the axion here, right? And then you've got the dendrites at the end, and then they connect to another neuron, but there's that space called the synapse in between them, and then it runs down, and there's the dendrites on the other end, right? So that's what a neuron looks like, okay? And any kind of chemical we put into our body, it acts, especially like any kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Any kind of psychotropic, thank you, yeah, that's good, that's the word I was looking for. It interacts in those synapses, is what it does. And it interacts in a couple of different ways. And so it interacts either by displacing neurotransmitters that are there naturally, or by stopping the reuptake of neurotransmitters. So this neuron is releasing these neurotransmitters that are wanting to get into this neuron, right? And so what it does is it stops this neuron from reabsorbing these, right? And it can affect us that way, or it can hyperstimulate the production of neurotransmitters. That's the way most psychotropic substances work. They either displace the neurotransmitters and replace them, or they stop the uptake, or they stimulate more release. That's just kind of in a big umbrella kind of thing. So that's how that happens. We have natural cannabinoid receptors. This was kind of shocking when people found out about this. They're like, why would we have these, right? Why would we have receptors in our brain naturally to manage cannabinoids? Well, it's because our brains produce cannabinoid neurotransmitters. There's two, anandamide, and then another one that they just call, I think it's 2-AG, the number 2 and then the letters AG, right? So these are two, and those are what they call the endo cannabinoids, because our bodies naturally produce them, right? So what happens is these things, we know that these endocannabinoids, anandamide and the 2-AG, they participate in our brain's ability to learn. They affect our ability to remember, to control anxiety, to metabolize other substances. And so it actually affects us in some way that, like with alcohol, it can actually affect our metabolization of alcohol. And the communication of other neurotransmitters between the neurons. And so it kind of has that, it's not just the cannabinoid receptors that they're acting on, right? So, but when it stimulates those cannabinoid receptors, it'll affect other communication that's happening. So that's the way psychotropics work in the brain.